Okay. All right, recording has started. Well, hello, everybody. It is so great to see all of you. It's not so great that we aren't in actual Asheville. We've always sort of marked the Asheville workshop on our calendars as, one of our favorite stops of the year, and been doing it for about 10 years now. Coming down there this time of year has always been such a high point of our teaching year, and as much as we're sad that we can't be there with you in person, I'm very happy that we have this opportunity to get together using the technology. Speaking of the technology, just a few things, and Lydia may have something to add if I miss anything. I will be assisted. We will all be assisted throughout the weekend by Lydia, not just with the producing technical side of things, but also there are times which we will announce. It'll be pretty clear when we're doing this, when we're actually doing some practice. Oh, thank you, speaker view. Did you spotlight me? Yes, okay. There will be some times during the segments of practice where we will say, okay, this is where, if you want the kind of feedback that either Lydia or myself can give you from carefully observing what we see you doing, leave your camera on. If you would rather not interact with us that way and get that feedback, that's perfectly fine. That's one of the great things about Zoom. You can either turn your camera off and still, see everything else that's going on and listen to what's going on. We just won't see you. Or you can just, some people like to turn the lights down in their room. So either way, that will signal to us that you're not one of those people that we're actually paying careful, close attention to what they're doing with what you're doing with your feet or your knees or whatever in some of the practices. So that's a level of agency that Zoom provides for these learning experiences. It's the equivalent of, flipping over the touch, no touch thing in the room. In this case, it's not touch, but still, it's about being seen. So there's that. Is there anything you need to say, Lydia, about the technical side or anything else?
No, I think everyone's got themselves set up pretty well. We do use the chat both for comments and questions. But if you have a comment or question, you're welcome to just raise your hand like you were in a real classroom, and we will do our best to get to everyone. And just take care of yourselves, obviously. I mean, the schedule, we set the schedule before we knew it was going to be all on Zoom. Can we just look at the schedule for the weekend together, just so we make sure? I think we have 2.5-hour sessions tomorrow, 2.5-hour sessions tomorrow. Yeah. And then on Sunday, we have a 3.5-hour session, I think. Even 2.5 hours.
Yeah,
2.5 hours can be really a lot and start the Zoom fatigue thing happening. So is it okay with you if Leslie breaks it up based on everyone's energy? Or did you like make plans for that lunch break or something? You're cool with it?
Yeah.
Excellent.
I'm just going
okay, so let's just, we just don't want anyone to zone out or like decide they have to check their Facebook because they're so out of it. So great. So
wait, they're going to have screen. They're taking a break for screen fatigue so they can check their Facebook. Is that?
Well, that's pretty much the way that I tell that people are really zoning out, is they start like looking at their phones, and then I'm like, okay. We need to do something here. So, all right, wonderful. I'm going to mute myself. I'll keep an eye on the chat. I did put the workshop webpage URL in the chat for everyone, and I believe the one that was sent around had a misspelling in the word Asheville, so do use this link. That page will be up forever. Well, as long as there's an internet and we pay our hosting contract.
Forever doesn't mean
And
what it used to these days, by the way.
that's
Yeah.
true, it doesn't. But it's full of resources. And as Leslie comes up with an idea, he might ask me to add something to the page, and I'll do that. So
Mhm.
that's what that's about. And now I'm going to mute myself and over to Leslie.
All right, thank you. So right now I'm using speaker view. So wherever the audio source is, that's where it will jump. And that seems to be what works best for the recording. And then there are times when I'm going to switch so that I can see the gallery view and kind of see all of you in your little rectangles and see your names. And when I'm in the gallery view, as Lydia mentioned, you know, a good way to get my attention is just to wave your hand at your camera. And another way is to use the chat, and we'll be making this as interactive as we can. And that's the way I teach. So when we first started doing transitioning these workshops to Zoom, I tried to reproduce as closely as I could a lot of what we were delivering live. Some of that worked out and some of it didn't. Like the thing that didn't work out was unmuting everyone and trying to ohm together. That was disastrous, just so you know. So we learned that one pretty quickly. As much as I want to, you know, do this like, let's all do it together and hear each other, it doesn't lend itself so much to that. But what we have done, which I'll ask you to try now, is I'm going to go to the gallery view so I can see you all. And I'm just going to, with everyone muted other than me, I am going to use the beginning here, the official beginning, in the way I usually do to help center myself and shift into the teaching mode and the learning mode. Teaching and learning, for me, are the same thing. And I'll invite you, if you like, to join in with that. So you'll be able to hear my ohm and your ohm. And I will hear only mine. So, and I'm a fairly low ohmer, and you're welcome to maybe find a range, a pitch or harmonic or whatever that blends for you. And we'll just give that a try, and we'll start officially with that. So. Thank you. Well, what a journey 2020 has been. I guess that's the understatement of the century so far. Just a little bit of context for how both Lydia and I arrive at this moment with you. Ordinarily, the fall is our busiest time for teaching, traveling. This is the fourth of what was to be a tour of the sort of east, southeast, Midwest. Um, we had our first weekend was in New Jersey, nearby where I am now. I'm in New York City, by the way. Lydia is in Cape Cod, Massachusetts. And the next weekend, Cincinnati. And then last weekend we were to have been in Fairfax, Virginia, and then down to you guys in Asheville. All of those were switched to online, except for the New Jersey workshop where we did a blended event where there were 6 people. It's a rather small room, so with the spacing, we could only have 6 people there, but it was just lovely to be back in a room teaching to live people after all this time. And everything prior to that, to these 4 weekends I just mentioned, including ours, has been online since returning from a month-long tour of Australia that lasted from the middle of February to the middle of March. And I arrived back from Australia sick, and we're assuming it was a milder version of COVID in terms of my symptoms. I never got tested because at that point in March, there were very few tests available, and it wasn't going to change my behavior based on a positive or negative test. I was feeling like crap, and I was staying home and not going anywhere. And not going anywhere was part of not getting tested. And also not using up a test that could have been used for someone who was really, critically in need of it, like an essential worker or something, or someone very sick, which I was not. I was pretty miserable, but compared to many people, I got off pretty easily. But the reason I'm bothering to go into this is that it taught me a lot about my breathing. And that's a subject I've been studying pretty constantly for the last 40 years. But this was a whole other level of education about having that kind of challenge. And I bring this up because I don't know what each of you may have experienced in terms of your own health over the past 6 months. If you've had a struggle with this, or you know somebody that's had a struggle with their breathing, but I would be very happy to bring that context and those concerns into the discussion at any point during this weekend, and maybe especially this evening, because the topic for this evening is an introduction to breath-centered yoga, and there's so much to share on that topic. But my goal is to make whatever we're learning as directly relevant to each of you as we can, and that's where the interactivity part comes in. And I will be counting on you to, whenever you're willing, just share with questions or comments or observations about anything we're doing, and how it relates to your direct interest, not just as someone that is studying yoga and studying to teach yoga, but just as a human being that, like all of us, has had to live through this really extraordinary last 6 months. So that's my little preamble. And other than that, I do want to say that I have a very, very strong desire that everyone in this group has, at some point or other, a kind of a useful, at least one useful aha moment, where something becomes clear, where something starts integrating in your understanding, that has immediate relevance to your interests. And that's the takeaway that I really design these programs to provide for as many people as possible, at least one aha. Sometimes it takes about 3 or 4 uh-ohs to get to one aha, though, and that's the other thing I want to say. Because if an aha is all of a sudden these various things or insights or bits of experience or learning or knowledge or questions that you've had all of a sudden coalesce into something that's integrated, it's a coming together of all of those things. And it's like, oh, that's why that makes sense now. All of those little things lying around waiting to be turned into an aha had to be broken apart from something else to begin with. And so that's what the uh-ohs feel like. It feels like the stuff you thought you already knew is flying into a million pieces. And I certainly can relate to that feeling, because that was what it was like to be around Desikachar, my teacher, when he was imparting his wisdom and teachings. It was very disturbing, and in some cases destabilizing, to have a lot of what I thought I knew about topics that not only I had practiced, but had been teaching to people, to have all of that just sort of go, what? Oh, I don't think I can say that thing anymore. And those are the uh-ohs. And for teachers, the uh-ohs are bigger than for students. Students have uh-ohs that are just, that basically their uh-ohs are no bigger than their own yoga mat, right? Because if you're just studying this stuff, as a student, and you find something that works better than what you were doing, you discover something you were doing doesn't work, or maybe some way you were thinking about things wasn't accurate, because sometimes anatomy, that's fine. You're not that much invested in all of that. But if you're a teacher, it's different, because it's not just for you and your own practice, it's for what you've been telling other people to practice. And so there's like an exponentially bigger uh-oh that is lying in wait for those of us that teach. And I'm going to put it in gallery view here. Just if a show of hands, how many people are actually currently teaching as opposed to just studying to teach? Okay. And how many people have not yet taught but are expecting to at some point, whether live or digitally or etherically? Okay, thank you. Okay, I see you, Charlene. How many people here can wave their hand and say, I actually am involved in the teaching of teachers how to teach? How many people are actually like teacher trainer type people? I see, that's Elise. Okay, is it just Elise? Okay, all right, so Elise, you're thinking, oh, well, if it's exponentially worse for teachers, what's it like for teachers who teach teachers? How big are their uh-ohs, right? Yeah.
Leslie, also Kelly
Oh,
McClellan
Kelly.
was doing a
Oh,
little
Kelly
like
was.
half
Oh,
wave.
and
Yeah.
Sarah, you waving your hand
Oh,
too? I
and
see you, Sarah.
Sarah
Okay.
also.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. So you can, the exponential size of the O's are being put in proportion here. Well, what if you're? Hang on, I have a thing here that I'm going to grab off the shelf. Yeah. What if you're a guy like me that has his name on this thing? And the teachers who teach teachers how to teach refer to this. Okay. Oh, there you go. Thank you, Elise. That's great. God, I would reach out and autograph it if I could. Oh, Angie has it too. Okay, do you all have one of these? You all have? Okay. Yay! Well, you know what? Right now, oh, yes, I see Margaret. Yeah, and Susan. Okay. Yeah, I love it. Cha-ching, royalties. Anyway, so Amy and I are going through this right now. We're in the final stages of submitting our revisions for the 3rd edition of this book, right? Which will be out around this time next year, we hope, if we don't screw up too badly. And so we're going through this, revising it, and I'm reading the words I wrote 10 years ago. And I'm going, oh, shit. There's a million copies of this out there, and I would never say some of these things that are in this book now, right? Because if that's not the case, there's something wrong with my process. If I don't understand things on a deeper, better level than I did 10 years ago, I'm doing something wrong. But the problem is, for me, it's like it's etched in ink on pages on people's shelves around the world in many languages. And so what I'm saying is, when it comes to the size of our uh-ohs, I got y'all beat. All right. So I know the feeling. I really do. And if and when, if I do my job right, it's a when that happens for any of you, and you're willing to perhaps share what's going on, those are actually potentially wonderful learning moments, not just for you, but for all of us. Because if it's not O for you, I guarantee you it's not O for someone else in the workshop. And if it's an aha, okay, absolutely, if you're willing, share those too. But just know that, you know, ahas are built out of the shattered O's. So that having been said, any questions or comments before I launch into the actual material? Just want to make sure you have an opportunity to share any thoughts at any point. And this is one of those points. Yeah. Are we good to move on? Yeah. I have it in.
There.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. All right. Great. So I'm putting it on speaker view
Leslie.
again. What? Sorry. What
Leslie,
was that? Yes, please.
it's Shirley, and I got a question for you. So,
Sure.
my experience with COVID this year, I'm in healthcare. So, and I'm actually in anesthesia. So sometimes I do have to put people to sleep. And unfortunately, I've been having to intubate patients on the COVID unit.
Ooh.
So I try to like talk to them because they're human and no one's been touching them. And it's been very enlightening as to how they react. And I try to talk to them about like breathing before I actually put them off to sleep to put a breathing tube in. So that's been my experience with COVID.
Wow.
It's very, because I don't know, at that point, I don't know anything else after, you know, I put the breathing tube in, secure the tube, and bye-bye, see you later. So
they're no longer your patient once they're intubated, right? They're off to someone
yeah.
else's care at that point. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
So it's very, I mean, I don't know how much of an impact it is or not. And you know, it sounds like you had a very mild case of it or a semi, you know,
Well,
awful
it was
case of
mild
it, but
compared to
you
other
don't.
people who were severely ill and hospitalized and intubated. It was pretty damn miserable for me, but I'm comparing myself to the people like the ones you were dealing with and calling it mild.
Right.
Yes. Yeah.
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 So I think, I mean, I don't know how much good I did. I mean, you know, as a yoga practitioner, and yes, I already have my 200 hour. I'm in the middle of my 300, but because of my work schedule, which is the only reason why I'm not actively practicing as a teacher. But my only interaction at this point has been with patients and trying to like get them to slow their breathing down because it's so impactful on them that they're struggling for air and they can't get it.
Yeah.
And, you know, I'm like their last hope. And I hope I'm not the last eyes that they see.
Wow. Well, that's heavy.
That
Thank
is
you.
seriously deep, Charlene. I never even considered what it was like to be what it is like to
Potentially be the last eye someone
potentially,
sees.
yeah, that's amazing. Yeah.
It's awful. I mean, I feel awful because, I mean, I hate to say this, but after those 5-10 minutes of interaction, that's it, unless they have to come back downstairs to the operating room for something else. And then most times they won't remember that anyway. So it was, you know, that whole interaction on the floor that made an impact on me. And you know, I know it made an impact on my coworkers, but I think I have a different perspective than my coworkers.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that. Like, that's as front line as you get, as far as I'm concerned, with this whole thing. And to have that perspective when you're dealing with someone, you know, and bringing that into whatever work this information will turn into for you, is something I'm really going to have on my mind. So how applicable this is to people that are that dire, I don't know. But what the main thing that this COVID, the breathing challenges I experienced with COVID, taught me was that what I had done previously, the relationship I had established with my breathing prior to getting sick, completely determined what the course of that illness was going to be for me. You know, because I had a question that was asked of me in an interview not long ago, like, so what breathing techniques did you use when you were symptomatic with COVID and you had these breathing challenges. And I was like, I didn't use any techniques, you know. That's not the time for techniques. That's the time for the fruit of the techniques to show up, right? And for me, it was my ability to notice how I needed to radically shift my sense of what felt like a complete effective breath. Because if I tried to get what my muscle memory, what my sensory motor system recognized as a complete breath while I had the COVID, I would push myself into a coughing fit. I would be trying to move the breath into and out of my body too strongly, too rapidly, at too much volume, with too much effort, just to get to that point, that feeling of there's a complete breath. And that's an important distinction that I've known about for a while and I've taught about previously, but really was driven home for me with this experience, that there is a difference, there's a distinction between having adequate oxygen to provide your body's metabolic needs in any given moment. That's we're calling adequate, appropriate oxygenation is one issue. And that is distinct from hitting that sensory motor memory I've installed in my system that recognizes I've taken a complete breath. It's not, that's independent of oxygenation. It's related, but it's not the same thing. A full, complete breath is something that I can either get to or not get to at the end of an inhale. There's that feeling of, yes, that's it, it's complete, it's full. If I tried to get there during COVID, that was the coughing fit. That was, it was too much. I had to recognize if I would just be calm, be still and as relaxed as possible, and allow a comfortable, minimal kind of breathing to adequately oxygenate my body, I could avoid the extreme coughing. Now, that came with a downside because what was also happening was that my breath, I was going into this state of extended apnea between breaths, meaning stoppage of breath. And there was a flash of extreme panic that I was with which I was unfamiliar, because I do a lot of like extending the pause at the end of the exhale type stuff in the techniques I practice. But this was different. If I lost track of my breath, right, it was not triggering itself to take the next breath when it normally would, without me tending to it. And waiting for my body's physiological trigger for the next breath would all of a sudden cause this feeling of suffocating panic to arise, like I need air and I need it now. And that's the feeling people with breathing disorders have, like a lot of the time, where there's this panic of not getting the next breath and then doing something about it that for many people is not very effective and leads them into the that sort of vicious cycle of expending too much energy to get too little oxygen, right? So I was challenged at both ends of the spectrum of the full breath I was accustomed to getting and the ability to just be still and calm with very little breath. And so my ability to sort of recognize that I needed to reset my defaults in regards to my breathing was very apparent, and my ability to recognize that and respond in a way that kept me going was due to the fact that I had practiced techniques. But I wouldn't call what I was doing a technique. Maybe it is. Maybe that's the COVID technique, but it wasn't something that I had in my bag of tricks. And I said, oh yes, I will use technique 2AB/4 for this COVID thing because that's the one that's going to work. It had to be invented in the moment. So, but how few people really who haven't spent some amount of time with themselves, with their breath, with their body, with their mind, with their understanding of all these things. How few people are fortunate enough to have had that context going into like a COVID challenge, right?
Leslie,
Yeah.
Kelly wrote in maybe similar to a panic attack, feeling like you can't get a breath or enough breath.
Yeah, that's what I was saying. That's the feeling that people that have breathing disorders like panic attacks or asthma, that's the feeling. It's that, and I think we've all been there at some point. Like if you get trapped under a wave at the ocean and can't get up in time and you're starving for oxygen, that feeling was waiting for me at the sort of low end of my respiratory activity, just as surely as the coughing fit was waiting for me if I pushed it too far into trying to breathe deeply. So it was an education, and there's still lingering effects. My ohm used to be pretty much twice as long as the one you heard this evening, right? And I can feel it when I put, because that's like a deep breath and a long exhale, and I'm kind of, I can still feel some of the lingering effects. Yeah. So, well, thank you so much for that. Any thoughts about any of this, about how it may be relevant to you and your interests? Because there's certainly a lot we can share. Deb is saying something.
Betsy, I think, had unmuted herself already.
Okay, yeah, go ahead. Yeah, please, go ahead. Yeah. Where are you? Who's unmuted?
Betsy unmuted herself, but it looks like she's not able to be heard.
Oh. Okay. Are you trying to
Who
say
else
something, Betsy?
wanted?
Because you're still muted. Yeah. No. Okay. She's saying no. Okay. Good. All right. Fine.
Okay. All right.
If she unmuted, it was an accident. She typed that. Deb is saying I became sick in March, and it's privately. Sorry, that's to me privately. So I'm not going to read. If it's privately to me, I'm not going to read it. So if you're okay sharing that, fine. If not, I'll just take that in and use it as context. Okay. Thank you, Deb. I have to keep track of the private thing here. So, yeah. All right. So my teacher was TKV Desikachar. I'm going to share screen here for you. So here we are. So are you all seeing the full slide thing here? Yeah, great, good. So my teacher is TKV Desikachar. Now, when I'm sharing, you're not seeing the Zoom windows in the screen share, are you guys? Okay, so you're seeing just the slide. Okay, so I have to move my Zoom windows around so I can see my slide. All right, so his father, his teacher, was T. Krishnamacharya, regarded by many as the father of modern yoga. And Desikachar initially approached his father for instruction in yoga because he wanted to know how it worked. He was in his 20s, and he had already been trained and had worked as a structural engineer, and he had a whole career just waiting for him in that field. A job lined up at a prestigious firm, all of that, and he ditched it. He walked away from it because he became intensely curious about how his father could heal people. Now, he grew up in a household where yoga was, everywhere, and he was taught it as a young person and all of that, but it wasn't his thing really. And in spite of the fact that he had done these demonstrations for his father when he was young, he kind of walked away from that and pursued his own interests. Now, just as an historical note, okay, this is what people tend to think of, an image like this when they think of this era for Krishnamacharya, which is related to the famous school that he ran at the Jagan Mohan Palace in Mysore, under the patronage of the Maharaja of Mysore. And here you can see my arrow here moving around. Okay, see, it got bigger. Okay, so that's Krishnamacharya there standing on, we don't know exactly who that is. We know who this is here. This is Patabi Joyce right here, doing the headstand on the left side. And this must have been 1935. We know that because this young boy here in the front, we know who he is, Keshavamurti. He left in 1935. So this had to be prior to him leaving. And by the way, it was that young boy leaving that left only one young boy still in the Krishnamacharya household that could be pressed into service as a demonstrator. And that was Iyengar, okay? And so it was when Keshavamurti here left that Iyengar started getting trained as a demonstrator. But all of this was in 1935. My teacher, Desikachar, could not have been in this photo because he was born in 1938. And so Krishnamacharya eventually left Madras, left Mysore to Madras in 1952. This school closed in 1950, 3 years after Indian independence. The Maharaja was no longer in a position to support anything after independence, much less a yoga school. So Krishnamacharya had to find work as a healer. It's important to remember he was a family man. He wasn't a Swami. He had a wife and children and a household to support. He had to have a job. And when he lost the patronage of the Maharaja, he went to Mysore. Now here's a photo of Desikachar in Mysore, years and years later, with a picture of his father on the desk in the background. So Desikachar was trained by his father in a very different way than these young boys were being trained in the mid-30s. Krishnamacharya had a very different perspective in those later years, right? He was being called upon as a healer, and he was working one-on-one with people. And he, in that era, during which he trained his son, Desikachar, along with a bunch of other people who became well-known teachers themselves, would say that the very essence of yoga is that it must be adapted to the individual, not the other way around. Now, that was not the essence of what he was teaching back here. Okay, this was training. This was, there are techniques. This is the right way to do it. In fact, you can see him saying those things in the book that he released in 1934 called the Yoga Makaranda. There is a link to this, a PDF of this book on that webpage we created for you, where you can look at all of the details of these poses, some of which are being cataloged for the first time. Like some of the standing poses that we're so familiar with were actually first described in this work, the Yoga Makaranda. And if the layout of this book looks at all familiar to you, it may be because it's reminding you of this. Okay, that is Light on Yoga, which was published in the 60s, 3 decades later, where Iyengar uses a very similar labeling and captioning convention and a very similar approach to describing in tremendous detail these poses that he is demonstrating. So in the Makaranda, Krishnamacharya would say things like, in Janushirshasana, the extended leg must not be bent at the knee at all, even a little bit. Period. That's how the pose is done. All right. That's a very strict description of the classical perfected form of the pose, many of which he was demonstrating. By the way, in 1935, he was born in 1889, so he's already in his 50s when he's demonstrating these and being photographed for them, right? Here's another one, Uttanasana. They're both Uttanasana. The one on the left we call Uttanasana now, but he called that Adho Mukha Uttanasana. That's downward facing Uttanasana. And the one on the right, demonstrated by another one of the young boys who ran away after having his picture taken for the book, Tiryanga Mukha Uttanasana, which is backward facing Uttanasana. Uttanasana just apparently means intense stretch, right? So he was very exacting in the way he described these things. And that's the same guy who years later in Madras, when he was training his son, would say the very essence of yoga is that it must be adapted to the individual, not the other way around. And so it's understandable why people are somewhat confused about what this guy actually taught. Because the people he trained in the 30s, like Iyengar and Patabi Joyce and a handful of others, like Indira Devi, for example, were getting a very different version of Krishnamacharya than Desikachar got. Desikachar got the physician. He got the older man. He got the one with more experience. The one who was healing people, not training them athletically. So this is the context in which my teacher was trained, that the individual is the most important factor in yoga. And it's individualized, breath-centered yoga. Desikachar was very known for his focus on breathing. And the individual always came first. Some of you may, I'm just gonna stop the share for a minute. Some of you may know people, students, friends, maybe yourself. When there's too much focus on the breathing for some people, it creates anxiety. It does not actually help them, right? As powerful a tool as it is for practice and for teaching us about ourselves and inquiry, for some people, because of their history, because of their physiology, because of whatever it is, because of their context, too much focus on the breathing creates a negative reaction, in which case you don't. In which case you say, okay, fine, there's other things we can do. And we'll be talking about a lot of those things shortly. Because again, the individual is most important, not the techniques, right? So I'm gonna get us up and moving in a moment, but I just want to see if after this introduction and setting of context, if there's any questions at all, any comments or reactions you have to any of this about Desikachar, his history, his father, individualized breath-centered yoga. Okay, yeah, we're good. All right, so I am going to move over to my mat, which is just behind me. Okay, and I usually just tilt the camera a little bit so that you can see. There's my mat. Just want to make sure that I am, I think if I pulled it back a bit, I'd be more fully visible. I'd be in frame. How's that? Lydia, can you tell me? Because I can only see my screen so much from here. Are we
Well,
good?
your head's cut off.
My head's cut off.
But if who needs your head? You could tilt the camera up a little bit more.
Okay, I can tilt it up more. Yeah, and I'll angle myself too, because an oblique angle usually gives me a little better.
Oh, that's much better right there. And folks, just so you know, this is one of those moments when if you're going to practice as well, if you'd prefer that you don't have my eagle eyes on you, then just either darken the room or turn your video off, because I don't want to be involving myself in your practice if you don't want it. And I'm going to turn my video off. There won't be too much to observe,
Lydia. There won't be too much to observe for this particular practice. Okay. But this is the announcement we will be making when we're going into a little more detail. When we're covering the reimagining alignment, that kind of topic, that's when we're going to get more into that kind of a detail. This is just because it's more technique-y. That could be a word. This is more of an inquiry. So I'll talk as we go along about the balance between technique and inquiry in this process. So I'll invite you, if you like, to stand. comfortably. You know, have your feet placed so that it feels like your heels are kind of under your sitting bones. So whatever that feels like to you. Okay, it's not an exact thing. I didn't say place your heels exactly, you know, 7.25 inches apart. That's something you could either get right or get wrong. But if I ask you to place your heels so that they feel like they're under your sitting bones, you can't get that wrong, because whatever it feels like to you is what you're doing, and that's great. So I'm going to, with some very, very simple step-by-step bits of practice, try to illuminate what I consider to be Desikachar's primary contributions to this theory and practice of breath-centered yoga. So I'm going to link very simple movement of my body to my process of breathing. So I'm going to start with an arm movement that takes my arms to the side on the way up and back down to where they started. So there is this arc of movement. My arms are moving through roughly 180 degrees of space, right? In this side space of mine. And I'm not going to talk about the breath in tremendous detail just yet. I want to talk about some details of the movement. So along with my arms lifting up and lowering down, I'm getting my head and neck to do that. And I'm doing it quite simply by directing my gaze to wherever my hands are going. And when I say gaze, I don't mean just rolling my eyeballs up and down to my skull. I'm actually literally pointing the tip of my nose to where I want to be looking. So I'm directing my gaze by where I point the tip of my nose, right? So I've already got two things going on in my body. There's the movement of my arms and the movement of my head and neck as directed by my gaze. So a valid question here would be, at what speed should I be doing this? This is where I would say the speed of the breath. So however long it takes for me to breathe is however long these movements are. And the breath and the movement are beginning and ending at the same time. Now I can vary this by sending my arms forward. In the forward space. So instead of moving in the lateral space, I'm moving now in what we would call the sagittal plane as they travel up and down in front of me. I'm still linking my gaze to those movements. And now I can alternate. I can go to the side and I can go to the front. Okay, so if you would just kindly do a few more rounds of that. I'm just going to come around and switch to gallery view and just watch all of you moving and breathing, those of you who have left your cameras on or your lights on. It's interesting, so many of you are just happy to do this without us looking at you, which is great. I love that you were able to make that choice. Okay, lovely. So now, can we pause and take a moment here? This is this is the interactive bit of this. We're going to get back to more adding to this little practice in a moment. I am very conscious when I'm cueing these things of not just what I say, but what I don't say. Did anyone notice that there was one sort of prominent thing that I didn't say when I was cueing that? Anyone? Just wave your hand if, you know, Julie, Sarah. Okay, so what, just shout it out, Julie. You go ahead.
You didn't tell us to move with our breath prior to that. Like there
Right.
was an inhale, do this, on an exhale, lower the arms.
Yeah. Right, right. And I did that on purpose because of what I had said previously. It's like if somebody is being, you know, triggered, to use that word, by too much focus on their breathing, you can have them do a movement that you know is going to change the shape of their body in a way that is consistent with the shape changes of breathing. Breathing is shape change. Breathing is the shape change of the cavities of your body. And anytime you're inducing a flowing rhythmic movement, whether it's with your arms or with your spine, you're going to influence the body in such a way that the shape changes of breathing are available to be coordinated with that without having to name the breath. You don't have to name that you're doing a breathing thing, right? So yes, that was a good first observation. And then once I did mention the breathing, did anyone notice what I didn't say? Because I said, Una, you're unmuted and you waved your hand.
Mind. One is there was no inhale through your nose, exhale through your mouth. And
Yep.
secondly, there was no reference to engaging any other parts of the body other than moving the limbs.
Okay, those are great observations. And I would also point out, not only did I not say whether to inhale through the nose or exhale through the mouth, I did not use the words inhale or exhale, period.
I heard
You may have thought you heard me not say it, or you thought you heard me say it.
I think I was so ready to hear you say it. My brain said
Right.
it.
Yes. Does anyone else think that they heard me say inhale, exhale? Because I very consciously excluded those words from my cues, right? And yet, what's that?
It's funny.
Yeah, it's funny. It's funny when, now that you mention it, wow, wait a minute. Did I hear that in my brain or did that come out of his mouth? It didn't come out of my mouth. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So, because I'm going to actually demonstrate for you that there is no anatomical reason why we have to cue an inhale or an exhale on certain movements. As much as we tend to like to explain why the correct way to do this or that exercise, whether it's this, the arm flapping or the cat-cow on an inhale or an exhale, that breaks down. There is no real anatomical reason why it has to be one way or the other. We'll get into that shortly. Okay. So what Desikachar would say about what we just did was there's a linking. There is a linking that happens. That's what yoga is, according to him. It's a joining. It's a linking. It's a relationship. We created, and it could be a relationship between anything and anything else. In this case, we had to create a relationship between our attention, our capacity to pay attention, and our capacity to move our bodies, and the fact that moving our body is intimately connected with our breathing. But I intentionally built it up step by step, trying to make as few assumptions about what people know or what they're going to do or how they're going to do it along the way. Because when we can, and you know, you can call this a technique, obviously it has a structure to it, but the simpler the technique, the more bare bones it is, the bigger a dose of inquiry can happen along with it. And so knowing where I want to be as a teacher on that spectrum of inquiry on one hand and technique on the other is really important. Because, I alluded to it when I asked you to place your feet. I said, look, put your heels so that they feel like they're under your sitting bones. That's a cue you cannot get wrong. Because who can tell you what you're feeling or where you imagine your sitting bones are to be wrong, okay? Now we can measure with a ruler exactly how far apart your sitting bones are and translate that measurement to your mat and say, and make dots on your mat and say, put your heels there. Okay, but that's not, the cue is wherever you feel like they are is where you can put your feet. So that's an inquiry-based cue as opposed to a very specific technique-based cue. A technique-based cue, you can get it wrong. The more specific it is, the more you can get it wrong as opposed to getting it right. In inquiry, its very nature is there is no way to get it wrong because it's whatever you notice. It's whatever you are able to pay attention to. Even if what you notice is that you're having trouble noticing or that you're confused, that's not a wrong answer to an inquiry. That's actually a fantastic answer to an inquiry. Desikachar would often say the recognition of confusion is itself a form of clarity. So to get a little more on the technique side of this exploration, what we're going to do next is we're going to specifically link a particular breath to these movements that we're doing. And then we're going to reverse that linkage and see what we notice. This is one of the most powerful and simple teaching methods I know of. I call it, try this, now try that, now see what you notice. Let's give it a try, okay? So, all right. We're back here, feet comfortably centered under the heels centered under the sitting bones. So we've explored this movement and this movement, the side to side and the front to back movement. And we have gotten the gaze going with it, and it's coordinated with the breath. So now I'm going to use the words inhale and exhale, just so that we can be on the same page with ourselves, but not necessarily with each other. So as you link your breath to these movements, which I'm going to ask you to alternate. One breath is done with the arms moving in the side space, and one breath is moving with the arms in the front space, okay? So just get into a flow with this, and as you get into this flow, I'm going to ask you to notice during which movement do you like to inhale, and during which movement do you like to exhale? Do you like to inhale as you raise your arms and exhale as you lower them? Or do you naturally fall into the opposite pattern? Just notice which one you fell into, because I didn't cue it. I didn't say when to inhale or exhale. Now, whichever pattern you have fallen into with your breath, I would like you now to reverse it. So now you're going to be exhaling where you were previously inhaling and inhaling where you were previously exhaling in those movements. Trying to keep all of the elements together. The smoothness of the movement, the connection of the gaze to what you're doing, your ability to focus on keeping all of those connected. Okay. All right. So we did try this, we did try that. Now we're doing, what did you notice? So what did you notice?
Okay, can I ask a question? It's Charlene. So
okay, go ahead.
Is it just inherent that we, because we've been conditioned to do, exhales to maximize? Or is it just the fact that we weren't just taught that? I mean, there's inherent breathing and then there is conditioned breathing as far as what's in my head. And then, then sometimes when I dabble in Kundalini, and then some things that are a little bit different, I'm like, okay, I'm really kind of struggling with this, because that's just what happens to be in the Kriya.
Yeah.
So, so is it really what we're taught and have learned, and now we're conditioned to breathe that way, or is it now just the fact that this is an inherent breathing, that this is what you do to maximize whatever your end goal is, I guess, is the best way to explain it.
Okay,
or
sure.
how I'm presenting.
Well, I can see where you're going with the question with contrasting what we've learned and what's just done traditionally for whatever reason, and something that's inherent. And by inherent, I'm assuming you're meaning something like this, it works better for the way bodies are to do it this way as opposed to that way. Is that what you mean by inherent? Just inherent in the way the body's put together, that some patterns just work better?
Yes. So like if I'm trying to expand, you want to maximize your breathing out. I think I have to do it myself, but if you're let's say folding in, you want to exhale so that way you can get the most out of your exhale and breathing in is I guess.
But why does getting the most out of an inhale and getting most out of the exhale have to go along with this and this? That's the question.
No, I mean it doesn't. I mean I just finished the Pankamaya, so I've been exploring that, and then now you're presenting this. So I'm just looking at the contrast. It's nothing different.
Sure.
Nothing more to it.
Well, let's look at what some people experience, because we've got a lot of action in the chat here. Okay. Let's see. Felt awkward at first. I noticed I didn't like switching the inhale exhale. That surprised me. My arms felt heavier. These are all different people. I'm pausing in between the comments. You can read them yourself, right? It was uncomfortable in my mind space. I loved it. Helped me pay attention to try the opposite. Whoa, you mean there's not just one standard response to this? There's no way to get this right and just have it be, wow, when you reverse the breathing, you will feel X? Who's the you in that sentence? Who's the you in that comment? You see, that's the thing about the individual. There's no universal you that's going to respond in exactly the same way across the board to these things. And we're seeing that in the diversity. By the way, the chat text is going to become part of the recording record. So this gets downloaded from Zoom, and that'll go up in the description area of where this video will live on YouTube, right? And I will not post the ones that are done privately. So that don't worry, you can still use them privately. It's not going to become part of the permanent record because the private ones will not be posted. Let's see, loved it. Became easier. Initially felt constricting, like it already exhaled and couldn't make the upward arm movement match the breath. After a few rounds, it was better, but it still did not feel like I was working with my body, but against it. Working with your body or working with your habits? You see, that's the thing. If it was really about your body and how it actually worked, that would be the inherent thing, I think, that you were referring to, Charlene, right? But that brings up a very big inquiry. How much of what I'm feeling that feels like just the way my body works is habit, right? So this zeroes us right into the actual core heart of how yoga practice is classically defined by Patanjali at the very beginning of the second chapter of the Yoga Sutra, okay, where he says, tapas swadhyaya ishvara pranidhanani kriya yogaha, right? Tapas is related to the things that we can work to change. when we work against the grain of our habits, when we do something that is unusual to our system, if we're used to sitting in a chair all of our lives, and all of a sudden we are asked to sit on the floor, that's tapas. That makes sitting in asana. There's no element of tapas to a body position. It's not an asana for us. You know, it has to be something that we're a little unaccustomed to doing, right? So it has to have that tapas element because we're working against the grain of our habits. And there are certain things about bodies in general and our bodies in particular that are not subject to change, that we cannot change them no matter how much or how hard we try. And to those things, we must surrender. That's Ishvara Pranidhana. That's the attitude of Ishvara Pranidhana. Now, the term that comes between those two in that formulation of Patanjali is Swadhyaya. Swadhyaya is this capacity we have for self-reflective awareness. In other words, inquiry. And so that's exactly what I just asked you all to do, right? Do something that's familiar, now do something that's unfamiliar, and what's the result? What does your Swadhyaya tell you? You know, it leads you to an inquiry. It's like, wow, this worked really well. That's interesting. This didn't feel good at all. Why? Why did it feel good? Why did it not feel good? Right? Oh, I'm sorry. Lydia is saying that AYC is the one doing the downloads. I kept thinking, because we're the ones who have been doing the downloads, because that's what I do. So, yeah. Lydia pointed out that AYC is taking care of all of the video stuff. So we'll see if that chat thing will be part of it or not, because I don't know what their policy is. Deb is saying it was difficult to maintain the opposite. Yes, it takes a lot more concentration to work outside of a habit pattern that is so deeply ingrained as inhale up, exhale down, inhale back bend, exhale forward bend, right? So let's see. And Marie says, I was surprised that reversing my train pattern was very easy and did not feel uncomfortable at all. It felt just as enjoyable as the train pattern, inhale up, exhale down. So here's someone who was like, no, that's no big deal. You know, it was easy. It was easy. It was awkward. It felt good. It sucked. I loved it. My arms felt heavy. I didn't like it. Awkward. This is why yoga must be adapted to the individual, not the other way around. Everybody has a context. Everybody has a starting point. Everybody has habits. A lot of us have training. A lot of us have paid for the habits we have, you know, paid to have the habits we have. And not all of those are bad habits. The question is, are we stuck in certain habits that are not serving us under certain conditions? That's exactly what I was talking about right at the top when I was relating my COVID experience. I had breathing habits that I went to a lot of trouble acquiring, which did not serve me all that well when I had that challenge. I had to totally reset my default settings of breathing to get through that without, on the one hand, coughing uncontrollably, and on the other hand, feeling like I was suffocating, right? So any comments or questions on anything so far? Because there's actually more technique-y stuff. Yes, Nicola, you just raised your hand, so feel free to unmute. Yeah?
I was just going to say, it's useful as a teacher to remember how panicky we can get when we're asked to do something the opposite of what we used to. I remember the first time I was asked to do frog pose, sort of splaying the legs way out in a way I probably never done before since I was a baby. I remember the feeling of panic and thinking, why is this teacher telling me to do this? This is clearly bad for me. So that exercise you just did reminded me of to remember that particularly beginner students might panic at the slightest change in what they're used to.
Yes, thank you for reminding us of that. But I would add to that and say, sometimes it's the most experienced students that have the most panic because they're the most invested in literally invested in the habit patterns that they have acquired. And so, and if you're a teacher or a teacher who teaches teachers how to teach, think of how much other people have invested in what you've invested in, right? And so it's not just beginners that have issues like that. We all do. We've all gotten invested in certain things. So yeah. So let's see.
A question.
Yeah, please. Hi.
So, hi, how are you?
Good.
So you think that we should not be cueing at all about the breath at all?
No. I'm not saying that. I'm saying just know that when you are cueing, you're teaching a technique, right?
A habit, habitual, or a habit, basically.
Well, we're teaching, when we give a specific cue, we're teaching a technique. It's like, do this, right? And you can either be doing that or not doing that. And that's important. It's important to have that sort of standard of, am I doing it or am I not doing it? And if I'm not doing it, or if I'm unable to do it, what's in the way? What is keeping me from doing this technique? That's the whole purpose of learning a technique. That's the whole purpose of learning a new way to breathe. It helps us to unlearn our old way of breathing.
Okay.
We can't, sometimes we don't even know that we have an old way of breathing until it's challenged.
Right.
So the whole purpose of technique is to understand what's in the way of the technique. It's not that once you master it, all of a sudden you have this amazing superpower, okay? You got the superpower along the way towards achieving the technique, which is to understand yourself better and to see yourself in light of this unusual thing that you're not able to do right away. That's why I'm always saying that yoga isn't about doing the asanas, it's about undoing what's in the way of the asanas. That's the purpose of it, which is why there has to be this element of tapas. Otherwise, there's nothing to undo. If I can fold myself in half, like a jackknife and just lay my chest on my thighs, it's like, I've mastered Paschimottanasana. It's like, no, you haven't. You just have a body that folds. There's no asana there. There's no yoga there, right? Anna Marie, I see you. Go ahead.
Okay. Since you're talking about that we've all invested and we've invested in learning habits, I have to go back and ask this very embarrassing question. From what I've been taught, I think you said something about yoga and the breath. My very first 200-hour teacher training day, our instructor said yoga is connecting your breath with your movement. That is yoga. It's the uniting the breath with the movement. But I feel like I heard you say that's not really
What was being said in that case was a technique of yoga is uniting, but yoga is uniting. What are being united is very open to interpretation and circumstance and necessity. Okay, I would never say that yoga is only about the breath and the body or movement being united, but yoga is uniting, right? That's what the word means. Yuj means, yoke, to join one thing to another into a relationship of some kind. But Desikachar, I'm going to quote him a lot, he's very wise, would often say there can be no yoga without viyoga. What's viyoga? Viyoga is separating. Viyoga is taking two things that have appeared to be one and demonstrating that they're not the same thing. So you can't, this is what I was saying about ahas and ahos. The ahas are like a yoga. Something comes together. What are the ahos? That's the shit flying apart, right? So that's viyoga. And so this is a really important perspective to keep. So and I know what you're relating to me about what this teacher said about this is yoga, but without hearing it directly from that person and inquiring, what exactly do you mean by this? Do you mean to say that if you're not uniting, movement and breath, it's not yoga? Is that what's meant? So I would need the context for understanding a little more what was intended when that was being taught. So let's see, it's the V yoga, V-I-Y-O-G-A. V means to divide, like the word viveka comes from that root. Viveka, which is discriminating awareness, right? So V means division. We get I think our word divide comes from the same original root as V, right? So any other questions or comments? Okay, Charlene asked how to teach without presenting another habit. Okay, was that a question that I missed because of some audio thing? Yeah.
So sorry. Yeah, I
Okay,
was.
go ahead.
But since you started talking, if you are in a class, are you that person who is giving up some semblance of self in order to become part of the whole? It's very philosophical. Sorry, you got me on this philosophical. So if I'm in a class and I'm teaching if I'm teaching a class and I want you to breathe A, B, C, and D,
yeah,
you are in general stating that you are willing to give up A, B, C, and D, but you're welcome to give up A, B, C, and D. But it's just a matter of people just knowing, having something to train in on. I mean, you have new yogis in there or semi-new yogis, so they're looking for something to kind of hold it together.
Yeah, absolutely. That's what techniques are for. They provide the structure for the inquiry. Okay. And so I think it's important to understand that dynamic in teaching. You cannot teach, well, you can try, and certainly a lot of teachers I've seen do this. They teach technique with very little or no inquiry. And what they're doing is they're being dogmatic. They're saying, look, you do this, and you will get the benefit. If you do it correctly, exactly as I'm laying it out, and get yourself to conform to my instructions, you will be doing correctly and you will get the benefits, whatever I say they are. All right. That leaves very little room for inquiry, right? And so technique without inquiry tends to be dogma. Now, what you're suggesting, Charlene, is what happens on the other side of the equation. What if you ditch the technique altogether and do pure inquiry? Well, what are you doing? What are you attempting? How are you, where's the structure for the inquiry? So inquiry without technique is just, it's anarchy, it's chaos. It's actually, that's very stressful for people, especially beginners, So I'm suggesting that, for me as a teacher, I have to know what the proportion of technique and inquiry is in anything I'm teaching. The stuff I taught so far is a lot of inquiry and not that much technique, all right? It's simple enough that we can all do it together. So in other words, I have very little fear that any of you are unable to stand up and flap their arms as they breathe. That's something it's very accessible. It's very accessible.
Okay, so basically you're saying, I want you to get this done, but you can breathe however the heck you want to breathe.
But I want you to notice how you're breathing, because in about 2 minutes, I'm going to ask you to do the opposite.
Well, that's
I don't need to tell you which. I don't need to tell you.
Along with what you're saying.
See, I'm sorry.
I know I can be philosophical on this. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry.
No, it's fine. We'll get to that. We're going to get to that. Okay. Let's get back to the math though, because here's where it gets super interesting for me. Okay, and hopefully for you. We'll see. All right. So here we are. We're a bunch of beginners in our first yoga class. All right. And Lydia, you keep flipping on there even though you're not saying anything. Oh, so can you spotlight me, Lydia, for now? Okay. Thank you. So here we are. We're a bunch of beginners, and we've been asked to do this, exercise that pretty much most beginners learn to do at a certain point. And so I'm going to cue this for you guys as if you are complete beginners with no preconceived notion. Are we good? Yeah, I saw an alert there on the screen. Okay, so with no preconceived notion of, I'm not going to assume that you've been taught this before, that you've had any training at all, that you know any anatomy, or that you have any kind of breath training. In other words, beginner. All right, so, and here's how I would cue it. And see if you can follow my cues without any preconceived ideas of how this should be done. So I'm going to ask you to come to your hands and knees now and place your hands so that they feel like they're under your shoulders, and your knees so that they feel like they're under your hip joints. Now in this position, I'd like you to bring your attention to your spine, in particular to a place that feels like it's halfway between your shoulders and your hips. So we're just going to call that the center of the spine. So whatever place in your spine feels like it's pretty much halfway between your shoulder joints and your hip joints, we'll just call that the center of your spine. And I'd like you to take that center of your spine and lift it straight up towards the ceiling. And as you do that, see if you can feel the two ends of your spine, by your tail and your head, dropping down towards the floor. So you're making that shape, that arch shape with your spine, where the center of the arch, the center of your spine, is lifted high towards the ceiling. Now I'm going to ask you to slowly reverse that shape in the opposite direction. So now the center of your spine is dropping towards the floor, and your head and your tail are actually lifting up towards the ceiling. So now you're in this arch, which is the opposite of the first one. And now I'm going to ask you to slowly move to the first arch. And we're just going to go slowly back and forth from one shape to the other. And the speed at which we're doing this is the speed of the breath. So you're coordinating this movement of your spine into and out of these arches with the movement of the breath into and out of your body. Okay. And as you're doing this, I would like you to notice, during which movement did you just naturally begin to coordinate with your inhale, and which movement do you sort of naturally coordinate with your exhale? And having noticed that, I'm now going to ask you to take a moment, pause, and reverse. So now just do the opposite breath with these movements, the opposite of what you originally established. Okay. So we're going to come back to this because there's different ways to evolve this into more exercises and more technique-y stuff. So similar to what we did standing, in how we progressed through establishing a movement, noticing that we could move it at the speed of our breath, noticing when we tend to inhale, when we tend to exhale, and then reversing that. So what did you know? But the difference with this one is, obviously it's a different position, but this is much more explicitly about the movements of the spine into and out of these shapes. And so I'm curious what you noticed about that. Are we going to have similar sorts of responses? Oh, this was easy, this was this sucked, this was hard, I had to really keep my attention going. How did it affect your breathing? How did it affect your ability to articulate your spine when you're doing it one way versus the other? Okay, so let's see, we're getting chat responses here. So whether I recommend cueing the words inhale, exhale, I think I answered that question. I didn't use the words until I asked you to notice what you were doing. I didn't tell you when to inhale or exhale. Sometimes it's an interesting challenge when teaching a breath-centered practice to not use the word breath, or use any words related to breath, and stick with the words related to shape change. And then ask someone to notice, you know, that they're breathing and how they're breathing. One thing I can be certain of is that people will be breathing while I'm teaching them. They usually don't suffocate and pass out. They have this capacity to keep the breath going. That's a wonderful thing about human breathing. It's both autonomic as well as voluntary, right? It has its automatic stuff, and we have our voluntary stuff. So if I'm not asking you to do something voluntarily with your breathing, I just know that your body's sort of automatic need to keep oxygenated is going to kick in, right? Which is it's a reassuring thing. Yeah. Okay, so love the idea of the arch. Right, and they're both arches, right? Both of these shapes are an arch. It's not like one is an arch, one is something else. So, you know, again, it's not, and I didn't say cat-cow. I didn't say flexion extension. I just said, here's a shape. The center moves one way, the two ends move the other. Notice that, right? Whichever way the center is going, the two ends are going the opposite way. When I got out of my own way, it was seamless. Could switch the breath without noticing the change, whereas I didn't like the change in the stand. Okay, so it was different to change the breath in this one than the other one for Betsy. Yeah, this one I had trouble correctly cueing in my tone data training because it feels comfortable both ways for me, and I always got the right way per the teacher mixed up. Well, I'm going to suggest that there is no right way. There's no right way. Based on anatomy, there could be a right way based on a technique you're trying to teach someone. In other words, if the technique is to exhale here and inhale here, and that's what you're asking someone to do, then that's the technique. That doesn't mean it's the right way to always do it, and that it's the only way that anatomically works. Kelly, you just waved at me. Good, so go ahead.
I have a question because I think this is fascinating, and I'm curious. The right way that oftentimes we are taught this, a pattern or technique, is to inhale on the cow. So I'm kind of curious about this because that's expanding the front side body, right? And contracting. Yes. So if you do that, and that's like your learned pattern, I loved doing it the opposite way because I really started focusing on inhaling in cow and really expanding the back side of the body. If you do it one way often, this learned behavior, are you causing imbalance in your body, not only physically but also like energetically?
Well, that's a great question. It's a great inquiry to have, and I would say that the patterns, the habits we have learned because at some point they were useful to us for a certain purpose. And this goes way back to our early development also. And there are certain situations that arise in life that will show us that being stuck in some of those patterns is becoming a problem, just like with my COVID example, right? But to go back to the thing you said first, front back body. By the way, you said inhaling into cow. I think you meant cat because that was because that's when I think you meant the back was being emphasized. This habit we have of teaching, exhaling in cat and inhaling into cow is based on a definite breath mechanic thing that's easily observable. And that has to do with, as you mentioned, the dynamics of the front of the body. the front of the body, when we focus on its breathing dynamics, very clearly feels like a back bending movement, or spinal extension is an inhale and flexion is an exhale. And our bodies are three-dimensional. If they have a front, you can be damn sure they have a back, okay? We don't live in a piece of paper, 2 dimensions, okay? And notice, and some of you probably did, okay? If I'm opening the front of my body, I'm closing my back. If I'm closing my front, I'm opening my back. So my suggestion to reverse a pattern, which for many of you was to inhale here and exhale here, was simply to ask you to favor the breath dynamics in the back of your body, where this is an inhale for your back, and this is an exhale for your back.
Yeah, that's what I was
And
saying.
yeah,
I love doing that because I often focus on inhaling and expanding the front side of the body. So whenever I'm doing that, usually I'm always opening the front and closing the back, right? Like opening the front with the inhale. But to be able to focus on using the inhale in the opposite way really allows you to think about using the inhale to open the back.
yes,
Differently.
yeah.
So I'm guessing, would you suggest then, because I love the idea of inquiry because you're just showing patterns that you're carrying that maybe you didn't know you were carrying, but would you suggest, even just for balance in the body, that you would do it, switch it up?
I'm suggesting it's always useful to challenge our habit patterns and some of the assumptions behind how they became habit patterns. Yes, I'm suggesting that is useful for balance. Also, 60% of your lung capacity happens to be in your back. Your lungs are bigger in the back than the front. Now, this tendency to privilege the dynamics of the front of the body with breath cueing is understandable. Because when you look at your body, you're seeing your front. When you touch, it's much easier to touch the front of your body than your back. It's back there. It's not as accessible. Okay. When you look in the mirror, when I'm looking at this camera right now, what am I seeing? I'm seeing the front of my body. My eyes are on the front of my body, you know? So this is what I call, this is nothing more than a prejudice. It's a frontist prejudice. So that's frontist cueing. That's all it is. And, you know, I think all prejudices should be challenged. Okay. So Charlene is saying GER. I love a comment that starts with GER. I always want to maximize breath. I have asthma, always looking for expansion. Expansion where? In the front only?
Front body.
And
I mean,
well, but what about your
I'm
60% of your lungs? You're in their back.
No, I know, but I mean, I'm cognizant of both because I'm a practitioner. But I mean, I feel personally, maybe not for everyone, but I personally feel better in my front body if I'm expanding my front body, because obviously it's something that I can see. It's something that when I just went to my pulmonologist and they're measuring what I'm actually doing as far as breathing, and they're like, "Oh my God, you're doing awesome. You maybe come off some of your meds." I'm like, "Nope, we're changing season."
Wait,
so
they gave you a vital capacity test. You were on a spirometer and they
Yes.
measured your vital capacity. Yeah, that's those tests are very easy to game, by the way. I used to win bets with marathoners when I worked at the Sports Medicine Institute, who were definitely better breathers than I am, considering their world-class aerobic capacity. But I knew how to game the spirometer, and I would win money bets with them because they assumed that this skinny little yoga kid, you know, didn't have their lung capacity, and I didn't, certainly, even close to have their capacity as far as it could sustain a prolonged aerobic demand. But how much air you can blow out of your body is only one measure, and not the best measure, in my view, of how effective someone is at breathing, particularly someone with asthma, you know. So what we're gonna do, and I want you to hold this question, Charlene, really, because this is a really important one, especially if you have breathing challenges. we're going to evolve this into more of a technique, because the cat-cow is what is you know, how we commonly describe this exercise. But Desikachar taught it as this, okay? This is Chakravakasana. It's named after a bird, the Chakravakra, all right? But see if, once we introduce some movement into this shape change. Now, here's the thing. This is where it gets kind of techniquey, okay? This is where you can get it kind of wrong, because what a lot of people do is as soon as they start moving forward and back, they forget about the articulation in their spine, right? Like, you know, the goal of this particular technique is to preserve as much of this shape changing of the spine as we were doing when we weren't moving, as we start moving. So I want to keep going into this flexion as I sit back, and I want to come back into my extension as I come forward, and I want to do it continuously. In other words, I don't want to stay in this sort of back bend until I sit on my heels and then drop. And I don't want to stay in my flexion until I'm up here and then pop up, right? So it's a continuity of the articulation in the spine that we want to continue in the forward and back movement, and find the breath which for you allows you to do that. Okay, so give it a try. Good, if you're, you know, I'm inviting you to try this if you like. You can just watch it if you don't want to at this point. But so there's a lot more balls to keep in the air with this one, right? We've got the forward and back movement. We've got the spinal articulation. We've got the need to do it continuously, right? And the linking of the breath. Now, all I'm saying about the breath is that it's linked to the movement. And find the method of linkage that works for you to keep the other aspects of the exercise happening, like the articulation of the spine and the movement. And then, if you found that, I will invite you to reverse the breathing and see if that affects in some substantial way your ability to articulate the spine, to move forward and back, to keep your concentration, your focus where it needs to be. In other words, how does it change all the elements of this technique? Okay, and this is where if you're willing, if you have your camera on and your lights up, okay, I'm actually seeing some stuff I could give you feedback on, but it would only be with your permission, right? And I won't address this to anyone in particular, but some of you are actually, you're coming forward all the way to your hands and knees, and your spine is still in cat. It's still in flexion, right? And some of you are doing the opposite. You're going backwards and not going into flexion, but sitting your butt on your heels and then dropping, exactly what I demonstrated before. Okay, so yeah. And that may have happened just when we reverse the breath, because everything goes to hell when you do that, right? So, okay. So what did you notice there? What did you notice there? So anyone waving at me here? Is this messing with you too much at this point? Okay, Nicola, I see you there.
It helped me just be much more aware of my spine and what was happening in my spine. Just to pay attention.
You mean to reverse the breathing? Is that what you mean? Or just the technique in general of keeping the movement coordinated with the spine?
Both, yeah.
Both? Betsy is saying, I think I did it wrong, but it felt really good on my spine. much nicer than cow-cat. You mean the movement forward and back, not letting it just be static like this, but to actually be moving forward and back. That's what felt better, is that's what I'm assuming you mean there. Jessica, hard to reverse the breath. Charlene, kept reverting. Yes, based on what you shared so far, I don't find that surprising, Charlene. Absolutely, this is a hard thing to reverse, right? For a lot of people, not for everyone. Some people, not a problem. Okay. Yeah. Deb's saying, I really notice how necessary the abdominal muscles are to do this. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Right. So now, I haven't actually taught you Desikachar's method to do this yet, right? Because there's an actual sort of uber technique for this. See, because his technique that he was famous for was this idea. We're getting some static here in the sound. I'm going to mute everyone for now. Sorry. Okay, that's better. Okay, so there was this particular technique Desikachar was famous for teaching. In fact, some of the early coverage of Desikachar when he came outside of India to the West to start teaching more widely involved him being called the yogi who breathes upside down. The hell does that mean? Well, traditional full yogic 3-part breathing has always been taught that it starts here. This is the first part, most important part, because that's the diaphragm, that's what the diaphragm is doing. Okay, and then it comes here, and then it comes here. 3-part breath, bottom, middle, top. Dirga Slasam, whatever you want to call it, right? Now, Desikachar taught this technique of breathing, which was that the inhale starts here, and then it comes here, and then it goes there. That's why I got called the yogi who breathes upside down. Now, we have to be very clear here. I'm not suggesting that his way or the other way or any way is the right way to be breathing all of the time. It's a technique. And because it's a technique, there's a right way to do the technique, but that doesn't make that technique the right way to do it all the time. That's a really important distinction. And that's one that I failed to comprehend in my early training, because I thought the 3-part breath was the correct, full, yogic, diaphragmatic, best, only way to breathe. And I got really deeply down that rabbit hole by the time I met Desikachar, and he literally turned the whole thing on its head, and it screwed me up royally. Okay. For about 6 months, I couldn't take an effective breath. And although I should have stopped teaching yoga, I didn't. I was betwixt a rock and a hard place, so to speak. I knew that there was this other thing that was going to work so much better for me because I had a glimpse, but then it kind of all fell apart. So I couldn't, in good conscience, keep teaching what I had been teaching. This was like one of the biggest uh-ohs of my life, right? It affected me physically. It affected me personally, emotionally. It affected me professionally, financially. I was deeply invested on all those levels in what I had been teaching other people to teach at that point. This is 1988. And it was all based on my original training, which was 3-part breath. And he had me do the opposite. Now, one of the ways to experience that is in this exercise. Because what he became famous for, and the reason this technique is useful, is it's a way of linking spinal articulation to breath movements. If the inhale is starting here and moving down, that means I can make a spinal movement start at the top and move down. And if the exhale starts here and moves up, that means I can make the corresponding spinal movement start at the bottom and move back up. And so that is a technique that is taught in this exercise. of Chakravakasana, where I'm going to strongly engage my lower abdominals to start my exhale, which makes my tail move back, which makes that flexion come gradually into my spine from the bottom to the top as the exhale exits my body in the same direction. Now the inhale starts at the top, which lifts my neck and head as it lifts my sternum. As the breath enters the middle of my rib cage, it lifts the middle of my spine. And as it enters my lower belly, it releases my tail up in the air so that I'm ready for the next breath and movement, which takes it the other way. So it's like this wave of breath that's moving from the bottom to the top on the exhale. And this wave that moves from the top to the bottom on the inhale. And my spinal articulation is part and parcel of that wave. So the muscles I'm using to articulate my spine and the muscles that are getting the air in and out of my body are doing the same thing. Okay, folks, the invitation is there. The gauntlet has been cast. Give it a try. See if it integrates some of the things that you were having trouble integrating the last time we tried it, or see if it just makes it harder. Whatever your experience, you're not getting it wrong. Because it's really about the inquiry. It's about noticing where you are in relation to the technique. This isn't about mastering the technique right now. This is about using that as a target, which is out here perhaps, and you're here, and what you discover along the way as you move from where you are towards the target. So that's what the technique is for. So give it a try and see what you notice. I love watching people think with their spines, think with their breath. It's such a wonderful thing to witness because you know it's so observable directly. The intelligence of the breath enlivening the spine and vice versa. And this is what Desikachar was known for on the technique level. Remember, he was a structural engineer. He understood this stuff. He wouldn't express it in Western anatomical terms, but he understood it at a very deep level and observed it very, very deeply when you were practicing. Okay, so what have we done? What have we noticed? Anything? I'm going to invite you to just wave or unmute or whatever. We're kind of in the home stretch for this evening. We got about 13 minutes left. So this is where we can open the floor for anything at all that's come up for you in any of this, even if it's purely philosophical. Charlene. Yeah. So, so go ahead. Anyone?
Yeah,
Just
for me,
wait. Una,
yeah,
okay, go ahead.
me bringing in the diaphragmatic awareness made for a fuller, more satisfying breath experience.
So at which cue that I gave you created more diaphragmatic awareness? Because I didn't really use the word that much in the cueing. So I'm just curious how you interpreted my cues into more diaphragmatic awareness.
Well, I thought of it in terms of top, middle, bottom, bottom, middle, top, and
Okay.
appreciated.
So so what I'm hearing is, and correct me if I'm wrong, sort of making the breath not just all one thing, but having it in parts, in regions, so there's a progression of breath was useful.
Yes.
Because you could link that to what you were trying to accomplish in your spine. Is that what I'm hearing?
That and the initiation point was very helpful. Just from a
Yeah, like where does
mechanical
it start? Where does it end? Exactly. So the framework there of the technique was useful because it's like, oh, this is where I need to pay attention, right?
Yes.
And so, and that's the great thing. That's actually one of the great results of this particular technique. Why we find it so useful is that it does give you a starting point and a path for your attention to go through that's continuous, right? It's not like you're jumping around from place to place. It's like it goes this way, it goes that way. The spine and the breath are doing the same thing, and eventually they are the same thing. Eventually, the musculature you're using to articulate your spine is the musculature that is changing the shape of your cavities, which gets the air in and out. And it becomes more coordinated and efficient that way, yeah?
And the brain can kind of step out of it.
Eventually, yes. But the brain has to be a big part of it in the beginning. Just like when you first learned to tie your shoes, your brain had to play a big, you had to remember exactly how to do it. And now you just don't think about it, right? So, yeah. Okay, cool. So what else? Anything else? I'm seeing messages coming in. Whose brain? Lydia. What a pain. The brain. I said the brain. And she said, whose brain? She's throwing my own stuff back at me. Yeah.
Hey, it's Charlene. I think it's all in the way it's cued, because the particular teachers that I gravitate to, they teach that particular way. So it's already ingrained in me.
That technique of inhaling from the top down and exhaling from the bottom up. So you've been training with people influenced by Desikachar, because that's the only place that comes from, really. Yeah.
Yes.
Well, but actually, it's not. No, let me take that back. I have to walk that back a little bit. It's Krishnamacharya, really. That's the origin of that particular orientation, because you find it in the Ashtanga methodology. It's a little more implicit in the Ashtanga Vinyasa methodology because of how they cue bandhas, because that's kind of related to the whole bandha conversation. Is the coordination of the lower abdominal pelvic floor action as it relates to the rib cage diaphragm, to the neck and throat. So it's definitely there. It became more specific and more therapeutically applied, as I mentioned, historically, in the Madras years than the Mysore years, but it was there. Because whenever bandha, whenever the topic or the technique of bandha is taught as part and parcel of something that's happening when your breath is in motion and when your body and spine are in motion, this particular pattern does tend to emerge. When bandha is taught, as I originally learned it, because I was originally trained by the Shivananda organization, so bandha was definitely taught, but it's part of pranayama, not asana, and it's only done during retentions. Your body is still, your breath is still, then bandha happens. The first time I ever heard the term bandha used in relation to moving breath, not retentions, and moving body was an Ashtanga Vinyasa technique, which, by the way, I learned before I met Desikachar. I was studying some Ashtanga primary privately with a teacher from, it was in New York, it was a teacher from Hawaii in 1984, which was way before most people had heard of it. And it was 4 years before I met Desikachar. So the seed was there. And then only later did I realize, well, it all comes from the same place, of course, because it's Krishnamacharya that is the origin of all of this. Yeah. So anything else? Any other comments to that? No? Okay. Yeah. Well, I'm seeing things in the chat. So if I could just maybe field a couple of those. So this one, I can comfortably breathe and flow either way. When I teach, I read the room. Day, weary have been practiced so far. Everyone flows their own way if given opportunity. So Kim, yes, which is why I'm so very open with the cueing, at least initially when I'm introducing a technique. It's like, what are you bringing to this technique? I'd like you to know that. I'd like you to know your own starting point, rather than me teaching you something that's so specific, at least at the beginning, that it moves you off of your starting point to begin with, right? So that is why I would never dream of taking a beginner that's never done something like cat-cow before and saying, okay, now exhale here and inhale here. I don't know, maybe that person is a back lung breather. Maybe they love the backs of their lungs without even knowing it. And they're just going to naturally want to gravitate towards, inhaling and exhaling, right? So here's the thing. I guess the way to say this is that I always will choose engaging a student in an inquiry over just teaching a very cut and dry technique, at least in the beginning. I think it's more powerful to get students in that space of swadhyaya, of self-inquiry, up front. And then from there, take that into the more specific technique, which is exactly what I did this evening. I started with the simplest thing you could possibly do, flapping your arms, noticing that your breath can coordinate with it, noticing some details there, reversing it, taking that same type of attentiveness to what our patterns are when we go into the hands and knees, reversing that. And then, and this was my goal, was to have all of that lead to this last thing I taught you, which is classic Desikachar, of the inhale, exhale, extension, flexion, flowing like a wave through the spine. So the way in which I'm teaching the subject matter is the subject matter. That's my goal, right? So we have like 4 minutes in which we can wrap up with anything at all that's on your mind. Any questions about what we've done or what's to come, or anything at all? No? Betsy, you're very good at letting me know you have no questions. Yes. It's just the ponytail starts going that way too, right? Yeah, okay. So, yeah, okay. So what I'd like to close with is something that we're going to actually open with tomorrow morning. I'm going to chant for you, okay? And this is a chant that I learned from my teacher, and it has to do with the sort of yogic concept of breathing that relates the forces of inhale and exhale to these ideas of prana and apana. And this chant identifies them, it greets them, it welcomes them into the parts of our body where they live, and it indicates they can move in a certain way so that they can have a relationship with each other. And so the chant goes like this. Om Namo Pranaya. Pranaya Namah. Pranaya Swaha. Om Namo Apanaya. Apanaya Namah. Apanaya Swaha. Om Swaha. Hari Om. Thank you for letting me share that and for the opportunity to share all of this. It's a great start. Really love working with you guys. Great interactions. We're going to start up again tomorrow at what time is it, Lydia? I don't have my calendar right here. Tomorrow we start at 9:30. It looks like. That's correct? Yeah. Okay. And we'll be sure to take little breaks along the way, trying to avoid screen fatigue, and have a great evening. Enjoy the rest of your Friday, and see all y'all tomorrow. Ooh, I said all y'all. There you go. Take care, guys.
Thank you.
All right. Okay.
Thank